Marriage is constituted by consent, but consent is to something. To something. And everywhere in history to the present day, anywhere you want to go, you find this description pretty much accurate. A more or less stable heterosexual relationship recognized by society as the community in which it is appropriate for a man and a woman to engage regularly in sexual intercourse and to beget and raise children. That's just a description. That's not an evaluation. Okay? Now, the difference between the Code of Canon Law of 1917 and the Code of Canon Law of 1983, and we could parallel them as the difference between traditional Thomistic exposition on marriage and post-Vatican II exposition on marriage, faithful, I might add, post-Vatican II exposition on marriage, faithful to the perennial philosophy. The difference between them is over the relationship between the unitive and procreative aspects of marriage. There is no difference on the notion that the unitive and the procreative aspects are both intrinsic to marriage. The question is, does the good of marriage depend principally upon the procreative aspect, upon the unitive aspect, or upon some relation between them? Okay? Now, if you've read your John Paul II, you know the Church's answer to that latter question presently. It depends upon the relation between them. Right? And that's what we're going to talk about. Let us note that Scripture suggests that marital communion is intrinsically good. Okay? Intrinsically good. In other words, that the communion between married spouses is itself a way of human fulfillment and flourishing. That its goodness, its worthiness, does not depend on whether or not procreation supervenes on it. Okay? Scripture suggests that marital communion, the unitive aspect, is intrinsically good. The book of Genesis includes two accounts of the creation of man and woman. In the first, you may recall, God creates the man, observes that it is not good for him to be alone, and so creates the woman from part of the man's body. When God presents the woman to him, the man at once recognizes her as his appropriate partner, as part of his very self, as his completion, as his help meet in the King James Version, the fitting help. The word fitting needs to be stressed here. I'm going to use it consistently. Aristotle tells us there are two meanings of the word necessity. One of them is proper to metaphysical being, to what is, and that's what cannot be otherwise. The other meaning of necessity is proper to practical being, things that can be otherwise, and its meaning is the fitting. What it is fitting, we must do. Okay? In practical thinking, the word for necessity is what is fitting, what is appropriate, what is right, as we sometimes put it. So when the man says in Genesis, this one fits, it means here is my necessary flourishing. This is the way I must go. Okay? According to the second account, man and woman were created together in God's image and blessed. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. Here, the fact that man and woman were created together in God's image suggests that their very communion pertains to the natural perfection of human persons. In other words, what it is to be human is to be together, male and female. Okay? But this account raises the question, precisely how is marriage related to the blessing of offspring? Okay? And that's the question that has agitated the church for the last 100 years or so. When I say agitated, I don't mean unsettle the church's perennial teaching. I mean theologians have taken the bit between their teeth and run with it in various directions, and it's taken us about 100 years to sort it all out. With Gaudium et Spes, the sorting is complete. Okay. We should note that St. Augustine held that marriage is in fact an instrumental good. That the goodness of marriage lies in its capacity to do two things. Its capacity to reproduce the race, that is, to create sons and daughters destined to live forever. That's a pretty high aim. And its capacity to secure us against concupiscence, against one of the fomes of sin, one of the ways in which we sin. And of course, Augustine says, for Christian human beings, it also has the goodness of the sacrament itself. That is, it is a means of grace. It is a means of communion with God himself. Okay? But Augustine did hold that marriage is an instrumental good. As a result, St. Thomas also held that marriage is an instrumental good. St. Thomas was not a man to contradict Augustine. He was a man occasionally to fix a bit of Augustine, and he did fix Augustine somewhat here. Thomas held that marriage has primary and secondary ends. And this is what we're hearing in the 1917 Code of Canon Law. Thomas's way of giving a more benign to the notion of the unitive sense of marriage, a more benign reading to St. Augustine than might be given. Okay. Isidore of Seville had set out what became the standard schema in Catholic theology for treating the purposes as distinct from the goods of marriage. The goods of marriage are the benefits marriage bestows on those who enter into it. The purposes of marriage are the ends in view that those who propose to enter into marriage ought to consider. Okay? Right, so the purposes, as distinct from the goods, Isidore distinguishes as three. First, for the sake of offspring, be fruitful and multiply. Second, for the sake of a helper. It is not good that the man should be alone. And third, on account of incontinence. It is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. Genesis, St. Paul. Okay? In his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, which is the only systematic treatise Thomas left us on marriage, he never finished the Summa Theologiae sections that would have dealt with marriage. So in a sense, St. Thomas's thought on the matter is incomplete. In his commentary on the sentences, St. Thomas, who drew on Aristotle, developed Isidore's schema, Augustine's schema, explaining the sense in which marriage is, explaining that marriage has a primary and a secondary end. The sense in which marriage is natural, Thomas says, is the good of offspring. And its secondary end is the mutual help which the spouses give each other in domestic life. Marriage is natural in respect to its primary end, since nature intends that children be not only born, but also brought up. And this requires the lasting tie between the parents in which marriage consists. Marriage is also necessary, or natural rather, in respect to its secondary end. Quoting now, "For just as natural reason dictates that people dwell together, since individuals are not self-sufficient for everything that pertains to life, which is why human beings are said to be political by nature, so of those activities which are required for human life, some are better suited to men and others to women, so that nature inclines toward a certain association, associatio in Latin, of man with woman, which we call matrimony." Unquote. Now, while Thomas does not usually list remedying concupiscence among the ends of marriage, he does teach that after original sin, marriage serves to curb concupiscence, especially in Christians, to whom the marital sacrament gives a healing grace. The distinction between primary and secondary ends was vital for Thomas in dealing with one problem, namely, how to reconcile the Old Testament custom of polygamy with the natural law. His solution is that polygamy did not violate the primary end of marriage, namely offspring, although it did interfere with the secondary, right, as the case of Solomon immediately illustrates. It did interfere with the secondary of peaceful dwelling together. Okay? By using the distinction and hierarchy of the ends of marriage in this way, Thomas affirms Augustine's view that marriage is not intrinsically good, but is good so far as it is ordered to higher ends.